video, we're going to create our own custom wall type. Now, we're going to be focused on basic walls here, and we're going to create a wall for this condition right here in these restrooms. So the wall that's there is a bit narrow to receive the plumbing that would be required in that wall. So we're going to create our own custom type to accommodate that situation. Now, what I typically recommend that you do when you are getting ready to create your own custom wall type is to start with a wall that's close to the one that you want to create. And I've done that here in this situation. So this wall is the same as any of these others in these other spaces here. And the assembly structure of that wall is that it is a metal stud in the center, and then it's got a layer of drywall on each side. So it's a pretty basic stud wall construction. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll talk about how to create our own custom one here. So to get to that assembly structure, you just select the wall and then click Edit Type. And that's going to take us to this dialog. Now, I do want to remind you that walls are system families. So we're not going to be creating a new wall family. Sometimes folks say that, but what you're really doing is creating a new wall type. Okay. Now, this is super important. The absolute first thing that you want to do here is remember to click Duplicate. If you don't, you will be changing the interior partition type that you have selected there. And when we finish, lots of walls in my model will get really thick. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. So the very first step is to click Duplicate, and then I'm going to give this a good descriptive name. So I'm just simply going to call this plumbing wall for this example and click OK. Now I'm going to click this Edit button here next to Structure, and this is where we can see the assembly structure of this wall type. Okay, so a few things about this dialog. First of all, mine might be wider on screen than yours is. This dialog is resizable. So if yours is really narrow like that, you want to stretch it out so that you can read each of these columns. In addition to that, there's a preview down here at the bottom. And if you click to open that up, then it gives you this little thumbnail preview over on the side, and that can be helpful while you're working here as well. Now, you've got two different thumbnails you can choose from, a floor plan or a section. I like the section because when I select layers in the table here, they highlight over here, but it doesn't do that in the floor plan. So let me show you. I'm going to switch to section. Now, initially, it's going to get really tall. So over here, there is a sample height field, and I'm going to drop that down to just 3 feet if you're working in imperial, or 900 millimeters if you're working in metric. Then I'll right-click anywhere in this preview and choose Zoom to Fit, and that brings us in a little bit closer so we can actually see what we've got here. And now notice that I have layer 5 selected, and it's highlighted there in the preview. Here's the core boundary. Here's the structure layer, the next core boundary, and the finished layer, layer 1. So I just like that a little bit better. I think it's a more interactive experience. And so that's what I recommend, is to work in the section preview. So now we're here, and what we want to do is consider the current assembly and how we want to modify it to create this plumbing wall. And it turns out that all we really need to do is add another stud layer and then an airspace in between the two. Now, let's talk about the way these layers work here. Notice that there's a green line here in the preview, and if I click over here on this finished layer, there's another one over here. Those green lines are this core boundary and this core boundary, okay? And those are always 0 in thickness, so they're not really layers. What they are is the boundary between the core and the finish. So that means you can think of the wall assembly as being in 3 zones. You've got the core, which is like the structural part of the wall, and then you've got the potential for a finish on either side, okay? This particular wall has 1 layer in each of those zones. Now, any one of those zones can have more than 1 layer, and in fact, the finish zones, you can remove layers, so you could have no layers in the finish zone, but you can't remove the last layer in the core. Okay, so the core must contain at least 1 layer, but all the others are optional. Okay, but you can have as many layers as you want within each of these zones. So what we're going to do is select layer 3, the core, the structural layer, and then click Insert 2 times. That's going to create two more structural layers in that core zone. So notice that they're between the boundary and the boundary. Now, the preview hasn't updated yet, and that's because the thicknesses of these two layers are still set to 0. So the easiest thing to do is I want to make layer 3 match layer 5. So I'm going to select the thickness of layer 5, Control C to put that on my clipboard, and then click here and do Control V to paste that in. So that's the easiest way to copy that information over, just using copy and paste. Then I'm going to repeat that with the material. So I'm going to select metal stud layer, Control C, click on where it says by category here and Control V. And now I've got those two stud layers established. So now I just need to widen the space in between those two to create my air gap. So let's click here in the thickness for layer 4 and type in a value. If you're working in imperial, go with 5 inches. If you're in metric, do 125 millimeters. So we're almost there. The only thing we need to do now is assign an appropriate material and function to this layer. So let's start with the material. I can't do copy and paste this time. So what I'm going to do instead is click the Browse button here and just find an appropriate material in the material list. Now, it turns out that I just want an air gap, so it's right here at the top of the list, but you can also search in this dialog. So if you're looking for brick or concrete or some other material, you can just type the name up there. But again, as I said, we just want the air material here. That'll be perfectly fine for this, and that will assign it to that layer. Finally, that leaves us with the function here in the first column. Now, the functions are a list of built-in values, starting with structure at the top, going down to the finish layers at the bottom. And there's also a membrane layer, which we're going to ignore for now. So the first 5 entries have numbers next to them, 1 through 5. Number 1, structure, is the highest priority component. Finish to 5 is the lowest priority component. So all that means is when two walls intersect one another that have varying priorities, those numbers are going to help determine how those wall layers interact with one another. And I'm going to show you that directly on screen in just a moment. So for the time being, let's choose thermal air layer, priority number 3, and let's OK, and then OK again. Now, the only change we're going to see here in this view is the wall is going to get thicker. Okay, so that's good. That's what we wanted to have happen. But now I want to show you that layer assembly in closer detail. And rather than try and do that here in this floor plan, I'm going to use this call out that I've placed at the top of the intersection here for that purpose. So select the call out, right click, and choose Go to View. And now we're zoomed in on just that intersection. But we want to turn the level of detail from coarse to either medium or fine. So there's a little pop-up down here. I'm going to choose medium. And now we're seeing the layer assembly on both of those walls. So this exterior brick wall has its core in this wide layer down here. That's the stud layer. And then it's got a substrate, an air gap, and a brick veneer on the exterior finish side. On the interior finish side, it's got drywall. Our wall, well, you've already seen the assembly of it because we just built it together. Now, to really understand how the priorities work, let's just temporarily do something that would not normally be done, but let's go ahead and drag this wall through the brick wall like so to get it to pass right through the brick veneer on the exterior of the wall. Okay, so looking at it this way, you can start to understand now how the priorities function. The metal stud layers in both walls are intersecting each other and cleaning up seamlessly. And that's because both the priority, structure, priority 1, and the material, metal stud layer, match. If either of those don't match, you'll get some sort of a seam there. It won't be smooth and continuous. Now, if you recall the assemblies, the next priority was substrate priority 2, and that's plywood sheathing in the case of this wall. And if I zoom in here, you can see that's right next to the core. Then next comes an air layer of priority 3, that's this one here, finally followed by brick at priority 4. So as we look at this, you can see that even though the plywood layer is priority 2. It's being interrupted by the metal stud layers because they have a higher priority. Okay. And then finally, when we look at the finishes, you can see that the two drywalls are cleaning up together seamlessly because they're the same material and the same priority. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better sense of how the assembly structure works and how these walls will clean up with one another. I'm just going to reverse that wall connection there, and feel free to explore further in this file on some of the other assemblies or try your hand at creating your own custom wall type. In this video, we're going to continue our exploration of the various wall families and move on to the curtain wall. So to begin exploring the curtain wall, I'm just going to create one freestanding out in front of the building. And to do that, you just simply use the wall tool. So the wall tool gives you access to each of the 3 wall families. So of course, up until now, we've been accessing basic walls with this tool. But if you scroll down, you will see the stacked walls here that we looked at in the previous video. And then right above that are the curtain walls. So choose this one here called storefront, and then click a point somewhere out in front of the building. Start moving directly horizontally to the right, and then type in 28 feet if you're working in imperial, or 8,400 millimeters if you're working in metric. I'm going to click the modify tool to cancel out of there, and then I'm going to ignore this duplicate type marks warning and just sort of click anywhere to dismiss that. Now, let's zoom in closely on this curtain wall and let's investigate a few of its behaviors. So as you can see, this wall is a little bit more complex than, say, a basic wall would be. Well, the first thing I want you to do is move your mouse nearby. And if you highlight the center line of the curtain wall, it will highlight the curtain wall itself. And that's how you could select it by that dashed line and move it around, delete it, copy it, what have you. Now, if you click away from it and then move back again, if you get near one of the divisions, you should see a little perpendicular line marking where that division is. That's called a curtain wall grid. So curtain wall grids are used to subdivide the curtain wall's mass into bays. Now, sitting on top of that grid is a curtain wall mullion. So if you just move slightly, you should be able to highlight that little rectangle. In fact, right next to that here and here are also curtain wall mullions. Those are just running horizontally down at the base of the curtain wall. And then if you move nearby this really thin rectangle here, you're going to need to use your tab key, but you should be able to tab in and locate the curtain panel, which infills each of those bays. So those are the different pieces that make up a curtain wall. You're probably going to be able to see that and understand that even better, though, if we switch to another view. So why don't we switch to the default 3D view? So I'm going to click the little birdhouse icon up here on the quick access toolbar. I'll zoom in. I'm going to select the curtain wall, which I can do by selecting the dashed box, and then hold the shift key down and drag the wheel to orbit around that selected curtain wall until I can see it at a better vantage point. Now, I think the first thing you're probably noticing is the curtain wall panels are transparent. So notice that we can see right through them there, okay? So that's the first thing that I wanted you to see. The next thing I want you to see is that take notice of the direction of the mullions. So notice that the horizontal mullions are being interrupted by the vertical mullions, okay? So we'll look more at that in just a moment. The next thing I want to direct your attention to is these little dots at the end and these little triangles on the top and the bottom. So let's take this little dot at the end here and interact with it. Now, before you do anything to that dot, I want you to look at the curtain wall and count how many bays we have. So notice that there are 6 bays running vertically, and they're all equally spaced. That's important, okay? So now I'm going to click this little dot, and I'm going to drag it about the width of 1 bay. And what you're going to see is that it now has 7 bays running vertically, and they're still all equally spaced. Now, if you missed that, try dragging it back the other way, and you should be down to 5 bays, possibly 6, depending on how far you dragged it. But regardless of whether it's 5 or 6, notice that they're still equally spaced. Okay, so that's the behavior running in the length direction. Well, what about the height? I'm not going to use this one at the bottom. I'm going to focus on the one at the top instead. And what you see is that we currently have a tall bay with a short bay up on top of it. If you grab this little triangle and start to stretch it, you'll still have a tall bay with a short bay. It's just that the short bay now is a little bit less short. It's a little taller. I'm going to keep stretching that and keep stretching it. And at some point, it will be tall enough that we can add a new tall bay. So what the curtain wall will do is it will add in another tall bay of the same size as the one at the bottom, and then the leftover just gets applied to the top. So it's similar to what we saw running laterally, but not exactly the same. Because in the vertical direction, we're repeating a fixed distance, but in the horizontal direction, we're keeping the bays equally spaced. Okay, so now that we've seen some of the behaviors of this curtain wall, let's keep it selected and come over here and click Edit Type. Now, you can position this window on screen so that you can still see the curtain wall in the background. And what we're going to do is talk about some of these settings that are in here. Okay, so the first one I want to point out is this one called Automatically Embed. I'm going to show you that in just a few moments. Okay, so just make a mental note that that is a setting that's there and it's currently checked on. And you can certainly read the tooltip here, which explains how it behaves. Right beneath that is Curtain Panel. It's currently set to System Panel Glazed. Now we can tell that that's the case because we can see right through the curtain wall. Well, notice that you can actually open this up and choose something else, like System Panel Solid. If I click Apply, notice that now all those panels are solid and we no longer can see through them, okay? Right beneath that is Join Condition, and it says Vertical Grid is Continuous. Well, we talked about that already. Notice there's other choices, like Horizontal Grid Continuous. And if I click Apply, notice that it reversed the direction, and now the horizontal bays predominate over the vertical ones. If we scroll down a little bit, we've got vertical grid and horizontal grid. Well, we already saw the behavior of both of these interactively, but now you can hopefully start to understand why they behave the way they do. Notice that the vertical grid is using a maximum spacing of 5 feet. This accounts for why they were equally spaced, because every time it gets close to going over 5 feet, it just simply adds another bay and then redistributes all of the spacing. Contrast that to the horizontal grid, which is using a fixed distance of 8 feet or 2,400 millimeters and repeating that along the height of the curtain wall. As we scroll down a little further, you've got your mullion settings. Now, these are all using a simple rectangular mullion at the moment, but you can change any one of these conditions and choose a different mullion if you want to see the effect. So for example, there's a circular mullion here, and I'm going to choose that and click Apply. And notice that all of the vertical mullions now on the interior of the curtain wall have changed to this round shape. So the one thing that I did wrong here, or not following best practice, is I broke the rule about always duplicating the curtain wall first. So what I'm going to do is cancel, and then I'm going to come up to my undo drop down here and remove those 3 modifications that I made to get back to the original. If you want to do any of those changes more permanently, then select the curtain wall, edit type, duplicate it first, and then feel free to make whatever changes you'd like to make. So I'll let you explore that further on your own if you wish. Meanwhile, I'm going to go back to the level 1 floor plan, and I'm going to focus on the stairwell here at the top of the plan. And now I want to show you that automatically embed behavior that we pointed out in the edit type. So I'm going to go back to the wall tool and start creating another storefront. So notice it remembers all of the previous settings. I'm going to highlight the midpoint of this exterior wall, and I want to be able to see that dimension there. And if you're working in imperial, let's go with about 6 inches. If you're working in metric, let's go with about 150 millimeters. And then click right on top of the existing wall. Move to the right horizontally, and then type in 18 feet for imperial or 5,400 in metric, and it will create the curtain wall right on top of the existing wall and embed itself within it. So I'm going to click the Modify tool to cancel, and we can probably see this better if we switch to an elevation view. So let's expand building elevations, open up the north elevation, and zoom in. And now you can see this curtain wall very clearly is embedded right in the mass of the wall itself. So it's almost like the curtain wall is a giant window now. Now, we've already seen that we can adjust things like the height and so forth and reshape the curtain wall. You can do that right in the embedded curtain wall and it will adjust the whole interactively. Well, what I didn't show you before is sometimes these numbers, when you drag it with the grips, are a little bit random. So what I actually prefer to do is to use my properties palette. And I'm going to set the top of this curtain wall up to the high roof and then optionally apply a top offset if I want to customize it further. Now, when I do that, it looks pretty good over here, but on the left-hand side, it's a little too close to this roof eave. So you could use the top offset to drop the height down a little bit, but then that top bay is going to get a little narrow. So what I'm going to do instead is take advantage of a feature that all walls have, which is called Edit Profile. With Edit Profile, you can customize the shape of your wall's elevation to any shape you like. So I'm going to click Edit Profile. That puts me into sketch mode. I'm going to open up my toolbox here and choose the Pick Lines. I'm going to couple that with an offset of 4 feet imperial or 1200 millimeters metric. And I'm going to offset a line down from the underside of the roof. Then go to Trim and Extend and trim this corner and this corner. Click Finish. And that customizes the shape of the curtain wall and it now looks a little bit better with respect to the roof. So there's plenty more that you can explore with curtain walls here in this file if you wish. And then when you're ready, you can move on. Sometimes you'll want to create a curtain wall where the layout of the grids and mullions is customized. So this isn't easily achieved in the Edit Type dialog, so I'm going to show you an alternative approach here in this video. So to do this, we're going to create a custom entry for the main part of the building here, and I've removed the door that used to be here, and we'll replace it with a curtain wall now. So let's go to the Wall tool, and it remembers that the last curtain wall that I used was storefront. I'm going to change that, and this time we're going to use one called not defined. Now, all not defined means is there's nothing set up in this curtain wall type. It's going to be just a big blank slate, and we'll be able to customize it to our liking. So I'm going to draw this directly on top of this exterior wall here. Okay, so you just want to put your mouse right on the center line of the wall. And I'm going to start about 1'6" away from the end there, or 450 millimeters. If you can't snap exactly to 450, you can do about 400. It doesn't matter. You just want to be offset a little bit from the end. And I want the length of this to be 15 feet in imperial or 4,500 millimeters metric. And you can just type that in and press enter. Now, when you do, it will generate a warning down here telling us that the highlighted walls overlap. But it's telling us that we can use cut geometry to solve the problem. So let's look at that now. I'm going to click the Modify tool to cancel. I'm going to click anywhere to dismiss that warning. So let's go to the Modify tab, and Cut Geometry is right here. And I'll click that. And what you do is you select the wall that you want to cut. So that's the brick wall. And then what you want to cut it with. And that's the curtain wall. And that will embed that curtain wall into that wall and solve the problem. Now, another thing I want to address while we're here in Plan is to select the curtain wall. It's got a little flip grip. Notice that the glass is favoring the inside right now. I'd like to flip that the other way so that the glass now favors the outside. So at this point, I want to switch views because I think it'll be a little bit easier to work with this curtain wall in maybe an elevation view. So let's scroll down here on the project browser, locate the south elevation and double click that to open it up. And then let's zoom in on the curtain wall here. Now you can see that it came in rather tall. So I'm going to tab in until I get just the curtain wall here and select it. And instead of a very tall, unconnected height, what I'm going to do instead is change it to up to level 2. And that will shorten it down to just underneath this canopy that we have in the front of the building here. And now I'm going to zoom in even closer so that we can begin customizing the layout of our design. So to do that, we go to Architecture and we're going to use the Curtain Grid tool. Now, Curtain Grid is quite simple. You just put your mouse near the edge of the curtain wall and you can add grid lines either horizontally or vertically. So let's add one on all 4 edges, and then I'm going to add 3 more in the middle. And I'll click the Modify tool to cancel. Now I place those kind of randomly because, like other places in Revit, we can simply come back and select them later. and use the temporary dimension value here to modify the position. So make sure you're clicking right on the number and put in 2 in imperial or 600 in metric. I'll do it again at the top, 2 in imperial or 600 in metric. Now you could continue with temporary dimensions, but I think sometimes it's a little easier to use a permanent dimension first. So let me show you that method. I'm going to come up here to the quick access toolbar, click the aligned dimension tool or DI, and let me dimension the location of each grid line. So I'm going to select each grid line here to add those as witness lines, and then also add the edges of the curtain wall on both left and right. I'll move down below the curtain wall here to place it in empty white space, and then let's click the modify tool to get out of there. So now that I have a dimension string, what you can do is select the grid line, and you will see a temporary dimension appear here, and you could use that if you want, but notice that the 2 numbers down in the permanent dimension have activated, and you can edit those as well. So that's what I prefer, and that's why I wanted to create the dimension string. So for the first distance from the left, I want to do 1'6" or 450 millimeters. And then the next bay over, I want to be 3 feet or 900 millimeters. Now here's a common mistake. You see the dimension, so you go right in there and edit it, and notice that that actually moved the same grid line, and it's changed the distance here. So I wanted this one 1'6" or 450. Let's leave it there. What we were supposed to do is change selection. So just try to remember that you need to change the selection before you edit the value. So keep going in that fashion, moving across the facade here until you have edited all of them like so. So just double check your distances to see if they match. Here's the dimensions right here. And now let's move on to customizing the curtain panels. So what I'd like to do is have a doorway right in the middle of this curtain wall. So your first instinct might be to just simply go to the door tool. And while that would work fine if you were placing a door in the brick wall, notice that if you try and move over here to the curtain wall, it won't allow you to do that. So curtain walls can't host doors directly. So what we need to do instead is use a custom curtain panel that you would choose on the properties palette that is configured like a door. So the first thing though is that none of my panels is correctly sized yet. I actually want my door to occupy the 4 panels in the middle here. So we can merge the panels together. Let's do that first, and then I'll show you how we can put a door there. So I'm going to select the grid line running right down the middle. And up here on the ribbon, we have an Add and Remove Segments tool. So I'll click that, and you just touch the segment that you either want to add or remove. So in that case, I've removed the one in the middle, and I now have a big wide bay in that location. If you want to reverse that, you can select the grid line, use Add and Remove Segments again, click the invisible segment, it will come back, and now you're back to having 2 bays. So that's how that tool works. So now that we understand that, let's go back to Add Remove Segments. Let's remove this one and this one. That merges both of those bays. Let's take this one here, add remove segments, and that gives us the final bay that we wanted for the doorway. Put your mouse near the edge, tab, continue to tab until it highlights that middle bay. Click to select it, and I've preloaded a curtain wall storefront door panel here, so you can choose that off the list, and it will put this custom curtain panel door in that location. Now, the way that I loaded that was simply to go to Insert, Load Autodesk Family, and searched for that family and loaded it in. So if you want to use this same door family in your own projects, it's simple to load. Now, if we look at it back in the floor plan, notice that it does have a door swing and it is categorized as a door. So it's going to behave like a door. It's just that the process of getting it into the curtain wall is a little more involved than just simply using the door tool. Okay. So in addition to changing the door panel, what I also want to do is the bottom base here, I want to use spandrel glass. So I'm going to highlight one of the edges and start to tab until I get one of those bottom panels. I'll right click it, go to select panels along the horizontal grid. I don't want the door to be included, so I'm going to hold the Shift key and remove that. And then with that selection, I will go to the properties palette, the type selector, and change from glazed to solid. Now, when you deselect it, it's going to be difficult to tell that we've made any kind of a change here. So let's change the shading mode in this view to make that a little bit easier to see. So there's a visual style pop-up here. And if you choose consistent colors, it'll do a pretty good job of showing you that the bottom bay is now set to spandrel glass. Okay, so those are the panels that we need. Now let's move on to mullions to kind of finish up this design. So let's go to architecture and click the mullion tool. It defaults to grid line, which means that if you touch the grid line, it'll add mullions all the way across. So let's do that above the door. Let's do it at the very top of the curtain wall, and let's do it for all of these verticals, including the one above the door there. And then finally, the horizontal one at the top of the spandrel glass. Don't do the bottom edge because we don't want mullions under the door. So what we're going to do there instead is use grid line segment. So you just change the selection mode here. And now you can place one mullion at a time in just the locations that need it. And then click modify when you're done to cancel out. So the last little finishing touch that I want to do here is the mullion joints can be toggled. And that can be a little nice detail to add sometimes. So go ahead and try that in a few locations just to add a little bit of interest to the design. Now, I did it selectively there, but if you prefer to toggle the mullion joints across the entire grid line, then it's a little quicker if you first right-click one of the mullions, select mullions on the grid line, and then you can use this button here on the ribbon to make them continuous all the way across, and that will toggle all of the joints for you. So I'm going to switch to the default 3D view now, the little birdhouse icon on the view control bar. Zoom in, hold the shift key, orbit around so that we can get a better look at this and kind of zoom right in. And you can, of course, see all the glass is nice and transparent. We can see our spandrel glass and our door. One last little finishing touch would be to change the level of detail in this view to fine. And notice that that will display hardware on our curtain wall door and actually on this other door off in the distance there beyond. So feel free to experiment further with this curtain wall, or if you like, try your hand at creating your own custom design off somewhere else on the facade.